I cannot claim the dedication of our Australian colleague who got up in the middle of the night, but the sun has only been up. Ethan, am I breaking up? Because it is on my feed.
You're breaking up a little bit, sir. I was just going to announce that to you.
Okay, I don't know if everybody can hear me. I'll try to go slower and see if that helps. We have basically 3 items on our agenda. The consideration of the report on the Russian military modernization challenges ahead for NATO allies, which will be presented by Cedric Perrin from France. The resolution maintaining allied defense investment momentum after COVID-19, and of course our elections of our officers. Like yesterday, you can access the documents for today's meeting under the Documents tab in Kudo. You will find there, including the table of amendments for our draft resolution maintaining allied defense investment. As you know, the deadline for amendments was yesterday, and so we thank everybody who has provided us with amendments. We will have a panel discussion on the Russian military modernization report first. We have, of course, Cedric Perrin, our rapporteur, who will give a presentation, and then Dr. Richard Connolly, who will give us additional information that will help us in the discussion and the adoption of this report. With that, if Cedric could ask for the floor, we'll welcome him, and I'll look forward to thanking him. While he's coming up, I'll show you. It's a foggy and rainy day here in Dayton, Ohio. So the sun's been up for about an hour and a half. I know you guys are well into your day. Cedric, good to see you.
Fonctionne. Vous m'entendez bien?
Can you hear me? Dear colleagues and dear Mike, I'm delighted to be with you again, even if it is at a distance, and I hope that we will shortly be able to meet again physically. And anyway, thank you very much, Mike, for having got up so early and to be with us today, even though we have already here in Europe spent a great part of the day. I'm delighted to present this draft report to the committee. As you will have noted, I tried to make sure that the revised report reflect our September discussion. I have also included, whenever possible, the amendments that were submitted by delegation in writing. And as a result of these edits and additions, I believe that this revised report is a stronger deliverable. And I thank you all for your contributions and your valuable contributions. I have also made a few changes to the document as well as added a couple of new sections. One is dedicated to the Russia's advances in electronic warfare systems. Over the past decade, this country has invested massively in EW technologies, and thanks to these efforts, the Russian systems are now recognized as peer competitors, and in some instances even surpassing allied capabilities in the domain. Russian modern EW systems have been critical to their operations in both Syria and Ukraine. In both of these countries, there's been a link being made to spoofing of global navigation satellite systems, which have been recorded to have an impact on broader civilian and maritime safety. We have also expanded the section on Russia's conception of future warfare to include its evolving use of hybrid warfare. Over the past few years, Russia has been using hybrid tactics and is escalating the use. And the most obvious and recent cases have been disinformation propaganda operations, the use of proxies and PMCs, private military companies, and targeted assassinations, included Abruv, by using military-grade prohibited nav agents that are, of course, prohibited. Russia's use of private military contractors have played a pivotal role in operations in Ukraine and Syria, and they have also complicated the situation in countries such as Libya and Central African Republic. The report also makes clear that Russia will will likely be increasing its reliance on PMCs in the future in order to intervene indirectly to many global hotspots. Of course, the report describes a priority of Russia when it comes to defense procurement and its ambitious programs, national programs that will allow it to renew the overhaul Russia's armed forces equipment and procurement process. Russia's approach to the armament program works on three principal means. First of all, a retention strategy, which involves the transplantation of modern technology and Western approaches on legacy Soviet structures. And secondly, an emulation strategy, which identifies American and Western military tools to emulate and to fit them in within the Russian military concept. And finally, a third point, a disruptive strategy, which involves the development of asymmetric means to counter those capabilities Russia cannot match. Russia was largely successful in reaching the target of 70% of modern equipment within the armed forces inventory set out in the State Armaments Program 2020, whether it be strategic nuclear forces and defense aerospace, actually surpassed targets. And they went beyond these objectives, whereas the maritime and land forces did not do as well. The SAP 2027 is designed to consolidate its predecessor. And while SAP 2020 directed significant funding to the naval and aerospace forces, SAP 2027 is balanced towards the Russian army with a focus on elite rapid reaction forces. However, the dramatic build-up seen over the course of the period covered by SAP 2020 has slowed down, and the SAP 2027 has now entered a new phase we can consider the sustainment phase, and the report notes a number of factors which have slowed or limited Russia's ambitious modernization program, and especially the impact of sanctions, the significant drop in energy revenues due to the persistent downward pressure on the international oil market, and the loss of Ukraine, which is an important defense partner for Moscow. 2020 has in fact turned out to be a challenging year for the Russian defense modernization efforts. The COVID-19 pandemic is having a significant impact on the Russian economy, both due to the broader economic slowdown, but in particular due to the near collapse of the oil markets earlier in the year. And as a result, the Russian Ministry of Finance has recently announced defense spending cuts, which will reduce the overall planned spending for the SAP 2027. The economic pressures of the COVID-19 have exacerbated some civil society tensions, as there is increasing evidence a growing number of Russians resent Moscow's allocation of high level of national wealth to defense investment instead of investing in health care, education, or even in pensions. And increased social protests and even a notable decline in President Putin's popularity have driven significant spending increases last summer to compensate the decline in living standard and household incomes in Russia. The modernization of Russian forces is not limited to broader investments, just investments in new platform. Russia has also engaged in significant structural, organizational, and conceptual reforms, aiming changing military district organization to rebalancing divisions and brigades to handle a broader range of tasks, introducing also a new command and control system, enabling more and more better equipped rapid reaction and special forces, by instituting a program of large-scale strategic and SNAP exercises to improve broader combat readiness, and largely, finally, by professionalizing the military. In addition, Russia has engaged in whole-of-nation defense efforts, focusing all leaves of national power behind a conception of threat that increasingly views Russia and Russian interests as under siege by a hostile world. And as a result, and from a military and modern perspective, all the means that can be used to defend Russia's homeland and conception are seen as acceptable. Furthermore, Russia's power now enables it to disrupt the existing global order is growing. It is clear from recent statements by Russian leaders that Russia will continue to use its newfound power to try to reshape the international system to suit Russian interests. And this is not only due to the relative effectiveness of Russia's military modernization, but also due to Russia's political will to achieve such a goal. Allies must therefore pay attention to this current and future Russian challenge, whether it be now or in the future, and it will seek to undermine the very values and institutions that we all hold most dear. We must together collectively enhance our capabilities to overcome this threat and other challenges, which means we must continue to bolster our individual and collective capacities to meet and overcome this and any other challenges. This the meaning of the resolution I'll present later on. And to do this means maintaining and even increasing current investment into our own defense institutions by continuing investment in our modern armed forces. NATO allies will present continue to be unwavering and present an unwavering common front. Thank you for your attention for this short introduction to our report. I would now waiting to listen to our Richard Connolly and to hear what he has to say on this very vast and complex issue as for the challenges that it brings to the Allies. I also like to thank Ethan Corbyn, who has always been very professional and who has been very helpful in for this report. Thank you very much, Ethan. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Cedric. I want to thank you for your report and the importance of the subject matter. Turning now to our guest speaker, Dr. Richard Connolly. The topic of his presentation is Russian military modernization challenges and prospects. Dr. Connolly is director of the consultancy Eastern Advisory Group and is an associate fellow at the Royal United Services Institute in London. He is a specialist on the Russian economy. He has written 2 books on this topic, and his current book, titled Russian Economic Power, is scheduled for publication in 2021. He has served as a consultant to a wide range of organizations, including government ministries and militaries in the UK, US, and other European countries, as well as NATO, the OSCE, and private sector entities around the world. For today's presentation, Dr. Connolly has some
tiny technical difficulties, it seems, with our connection to Dayton, Ohio. I'll take this opportunity to ask Dr. Richard Connolly to request the floor, please. And hopefully we can have our chairman back. If not, we will...
Flash.
Mr. Turner, seems we might have lost you briefly. With that, I guess we will move to the presentation by Dr. Richard Connolly at this point, and I believe that will then put me off the screen. Richard?
Thank you very much, Ethan, and thank you very much, Mr. Turner, for the introduction that you were halfway through, but I'm sure you were about to give or did give in Dayton, Ohio. Good afternoon to everybody else that is tuning into this, or good morning, depending on where in the world you are tuning in from. I'd like to start by first thanking everybody for the invitation to speak today, firstly, and secondly for inviting me to make some brief comments on what, if I may say so, was an excellent report on the subject of Russian military modernization. Now, I have been asked to speak for about 15 minutes, so I'm going to make just a few what I think are the most important, from my perspective, points about the nature of Russian military modernization. Some of these points are highlighted in the report, and some of the future prospects for Russian military modernization. Now, I, as an economist, am not as well equipped to speak about the political aspects of Russian military modernization, but some of those were covered, I thought, very well, very concisely by the previous speaker, and are discussed in detail within the report. So I'm just going to focus on the economic dimensions because that's where I'm best qualified to speak. So next slide, please. So over the course of the next 15 minutes, I will, next slide, please. Firstly, highlight the main point. And this is one that I've done a lot of work on, and that's the importance of measuring Russian defense expenditure correctly and as a result accurately. Because this brings, this yields certain conclusions and policy implications that are not necessarily reached if we use the incorrect measure of defense expenditure. So I'll discuss that for a few minutes, and then I'm going to identify some of the key areas of strength and weakness in Russian military modernization over the last decade, and highlight some of the reasons for this variation in performance. I'll then also talk about the prospects for Russian military modernization in the future, in particular looking at how much money Russia spends on research and development, and on how that money that is spent on research and development is likely to filter through to new weapon systems well into the next decade. I'll finish by speaking about some non-military capabilities that are related to Russia's economic capacity, and how they can be used in conjunction or separate from Russia's military capabilities, and finish with some discussion of what this all means for NATO and NATO members. Next slide, please. So the first point that I want to make is that we should be very careful about the measure that we use when assessing how much Russia spends on its military. The traditional measure that is used by most think tanks, if I think of SIPRI in Stockholm, IISS in London, and most media outlets. Until very recently, most reports of Russian military expenditure and also Chinese military expenditure, Iranian, would focus on giving a dollar value. And that dollar value uses current market exchange rates. If we use current market exchange rates over the course of the last 20 years, when we look at Russia, we would see that its level of military expenditure has tended to fluctuate between, as we can see here, just under $30 billion in 2005, up to a peak in 2015 and 16 of just under $70 billion. And that's a significant amount. That will put Russia in the top 10 of military spenders in the world, but it would put it on roughly, if we take the most recent year in 2019, on a par with countries like the United Kingdom and with France. But it will be a long way behind the United States, a long way behind China, and it would make it, one of a second tier of countries in terms of military expenditure. What I would like to make, the point that I've made in my writing elsewhere, and I will make today, is that this is the wrong measure to use. We should not be using market exchange rates. Market exchange rates are very useful for measuring certain aspects, dimensions of economic activity across the world. But if we're looking at the size of another economy, if we're looking at the standard of living in another country, and if we're looking at the procurement of goods and services in another economy, especially in those countries where those goods and services are derived from the domestic production base, which they are in Russia, in contrast to, let's say, Saudi Arabia, which tends to import a lot of its military goods. In those countries, we need to use a purchasing power parity exchange rate. And this is an exchange rate, without wishing to go into too much detail, that adjusts for differences in costs across countries. And the central point to make here is that when the Russian government makes decisions to allocate resources towards military purposes, it purchases goods and services, so military equipment, the services provided by military units, military personnel, the services provided by people providing logistics within the Russian military. It does all of this in Russian rubles. It doesn't use US dollars. And a Russian ruble goes a lot further within Russia than a market exchange rate would suggest. So that's the essence of this distinction. This is the most appropriate measure, the PPP measure. And what you've got here is a measure that I have developed, which basically looks at changes in costs in the types of inputs that are used for military expenditure. So wages for personnel in the military and also wages for people working in the defense industry. And as you can see here, this yields a very different result. We can see that in recent years, Russian military expenditure has tended to fluctuate between 150 and 170 billion dollars. So this is considerably higher than a market exchange rate measure would reveal. And this, I think, is very important because it helps explain why Russia has been able to procure as much military equipment as it has over the past decade. And it's why it's able to put so many people in uniform, well over 1 million if we include paramilitary forces, and why it's able to conduct the military operations that it has been in Ukraine, Syria, and elsewhere. So PPP is very important. Next slide, please, and helps us explain why Russia does as well. We can see here, by the way, one of the problems with using market exchange rates is that even when Russian military expenditure is rising, as it is in the red line here, as it did in 2015 and 16, in market exchange rates suggested that in fact military expenditure was declining. And that was simply because of the change in the value of the Russian ruble relative to the US dollar. So while Russia was surging ahead with its military modernization expenditure in 2014, 15, and 16, the red line, market exchange rates revealed that it was going down. That, I think, is a very useful and pithy way of illustrating the problems with using the market exchange rate measure. Next slide, please. If we look over time, we can see that much of the modernization that we have seen take place over the last decade has taken place as a result of this sharp increase in expenditure since 2010. And there are different measures that we can use, whether we're using a very narrow definition of Russian expenditure on the red line or a broader one, as you can see in the blue and green lines. But either way, we can see this increase between 2010 and 2016, and then a moderation since then, if we're measuring expenditure as a proportion of GDP. So much of the hard work, financially speaking, took place before 2016. Since then, the defense burden, that is the proportion of GDP allocated to military expenditure in Russia, has declined and is now at around about the historic average level that we've seen over the course of the last 20 years. So if we think that the Russian military expenditure or modernization was exerting too much of a burden, that might have been the case back in 2016, when broader measures would suggest that Russia was spending around about 5.5% of GDP on its military. But not so today. It's below 4% and closer to the defense burden that the United States exhibits. Next slide, please. One particularly important aspect of Russian military expenditure is the importance of procurement. We can see here how prior to the modernization program in 2012, procurement accounted for around about a quarter, just over, of Russian military expenditure. However, by the time we get to 2015, 14, 15, that had gone up to nearly half and has declined since. So this is where the bulk of the expenditure on equipment procurement took place. We can see that that has declined since. Next slide, please. And I should make that point on military procurement, that of course stands in stark contrast to NATO members, where procurement accounts for a much smaller share of total military expenditure, around about a fifth usually, depending on the country. Hopefully I've made the point there, Russia spends more than most people would appreciate. And that's why I think we should expect it to continue to have enough money to sustain this great power competition with the United States, with NATO, and to be able to achieve some of those political objectives described by the previous speaker. If we look at some of the areas of strength and weakness, some of which were described previously, I'll pick on two areas of strength. Number one, combat aircraft. Over the course of the last decade, Russia has taken delivery of around about 500 combat aircraft. That's more than the United States and China took delivery of over that same period. So that's pretty impressive. They didn't hit all of their targets, but they did nevertheless take delivery of a substantial number of aircraft, and that has updated the fleet of combat aircraft. However, where Russia differs is insofar as most of the aircraft delivered are either 4th or 4++ generation combat aircraft. Where Russia hasn't been very successful is in producing 5th generation aircraft. We can see here the Sukhoi 57, only 10 units have been delivered. And of those 10, each one is very different to the one before. They're all individual efforts. This is not a serial production, and that has yet to begin. So Russia has failed to meet its targets in 5th generation aircraft, even if it has performed well in producing 4th and 4th plus generation aircraft. Next slide, please. Another area where Russia has done particularly well is in producing long-range ballistic missiles. We can see here that since 2010, Russia has taken delivery of over 300 long-range nuclear-armed ballistic missiles. That's considerably more than China, of course, far more than the United States, although the United States started from a very modern position at the beginning of this century. So they came from different starting points. But the point is now that Russia has arguably the most modern long-range ballistic missile force in the world, which is in particular on land when compared to other countries. So that's why Russia's done well. It's also done well in air defense systems, a whole range of systems ranging from short-range Pantsir to the long-range S-400. It's done well in taking delivery of military helicopters. Where it hasn't done so well, as the previous speaker described, is in large naval platforms. So Russia's done well in producing small missile ships, corvettes, several frigates, but it hasn't been able to produce anything in the way of large blue water vessels. It's been much slower at producing nuclear-armed submarines than the Russian Navy would have liked as well. Similarly, despite the great fanfare that greeted the T-14's introduction to the world in 2015, the T-14 Armata main battle tank, we have yet to see that enter serial production. As a result, the vast majority of the tanks that have been delivered to Russia over the course of the last 10 years have been updated versions of the T-72, the T-72B3. This is still a very capable tank, and quantity has its own quality. They've taken delivery of around about 1,500. So this has substantially improved Russia's capabilities. But nevertheless, it's worth appreciating that this is nevertheless a different type of tank to that which they had hoped to build at the outset of the military modernization program. Next slide, please. Looking to the future, what are the possibilities for Russia producing a large number of new weapon systems, of building new generation submarines, tanks, aircraft, UAVs, etc.? Well, let's make a simple point here, and that is if we look again at research and development expenditure and compare it between Russia and the United States, and measured at PPP, we can see two types of pictures. One, on the left, if we look at R&D overall for the entire economy, so this is including civilian applications, we can see that Russian R&D is dwarfed by the United States. Russia's R&D is a tiny fraction of the United States overall R&D. That's because the US includes an enormous amount of private sector research and development. But if we just look at the amount of money devoted by the government to military R&D, and we measure this at purchasing power parity, which we should because they pay their scientists in rubles, we can see that Russia actually is invests just under half of what the United States invests on military R&D. And this, I think, should lead us to believe that Russia will perform reasonably well in the years to come in developing hypersonic missiles, in developing new types of systems. This will enable Russia to punch above its economic weight over the course of the next decade, and I would expect it to field new platforms. However, that doesn't mean that Russia will necessarily keep up with the US and NATO in the fielding of new systems. And that's because whilst Russia is very good at inventing and developing new systems, and in particular in these asymmetric technologies that was mentioned by the previous speaker, the Russian defense industrial base is less adept at serial production of those goods that have been developed and invented. And this is the big weakness, the Achilles heel of the Russian defense industry. They can invent new systems, they can develop small numbers of prototypes, but when it comes to putting new systems into serial production, this is where the Russian armed forces have performed much worse over the course of the last decade. And in a sense, the point that I made about the areas of strength, ICBMs and fourth generation aircraft, these are areas where Russia had been producing these types of weapons for a long time anyway. But when it comes to having the high-tech machinery, the precision machine tools that are required to generate new productive capabilities for new systems, Russia's lags and doesn't do as well. Next slide, please. My final point that I want to make is that Russia has other economic capabilities that enable it to project influence abroad, either in conjunction with or alongside, or even indeed separate to its military capabilities. And this map here is a map of where Russia is a key supplier of strategically important goods. And they are oil, gas, nuclear power plants, weaponry. Russia's the second largest exporter of weaponry, and food, grain. And those countries where the color is darkest in red is where Russia is a key supplier of all 5 of those strategically important goods. And if we look at this map of the world, we can see that Russia has, over the course of the last decade or so, carved out a very strong role on the markets of South and Southeast Asia. We can see here China, India, Vietnam, Bangladesh, Indonesia, and North Africa and the Middle East. It's even penetrating some markets in South America and even in sub-Saharan Africa as well. And I think this is something to watch in the future, because this is one way in which Russia can operate within the so-called grey zone. That is, it doesn't necessarily need to deploy hard military capabilities to project or enjoy political influence. It can also use other economic instruments to get, in some ways, just as high gains elsewhere in the world. And so I think it's important that we recognize that these are important instruments of foreign economic policy. Next slide, please. Finally, thinking about what all of this means for NATO, for the people in the audience today. Number one, we need to avoid complacency in our assessment of Russia's ability to sustain what the US call great power competition, whatever you want to call it, a more assertive foreign policy. A lot of people speak about Russia's economic weaknesses, but the fact of the matter is that over the course of the last 30 years, even when Russia has been experiencing economic hardship, especially in the 1990s, it never once spent less than 3.5% of GDP on its military. And the Russian military today is much leaner, much meaner, much more modern than it was in the 1990s and early 2000s. So it doesn't need to spend as much in order to maintain the levels of capability that it has at the moment. And as I've shown with the R&D expenditure, I think it will have plenty of scope for developing new systems in the future. And therefore, that means for NATO members that we need collectively to ensure that spending is appropriate and focused on the challenges posed by Russia, focused on those challenges where Russia is performing better or best. We also need to acknowledge areas of Russian strength, as well as identifying areas of enduring weaknesses. That is, we need to reach a balanced assessment. Russia is neither 10 feet tall, nor is it 4 foot short. It is instead 5'11", has a limp, and has a stronger left hook than it does a right jab, to stretch my metaphors. It has areas where it does very well, where its defense industry proves quite capable, where its operational doctrine is quite capable, is best, and it has areas of weakness. It's less strong at sea than it is on land, for instance. And we also need to think about how these military capabilities fit in with Russia's strategic thinking and direction and operational doctrine. As I've just said at the end, we also need to not ignore non-military instruments. And I don't mean just so-called hybrid warfare. Hybrid warfare has been around since the beginning of time. It simply means using all instruments available at your disposal. And an area that I've just identified there is an area that so far I've not seen many people speak about. But every day, Russian firms, state-owned firms, representatives of the Russian state are fanning out across the world, forming close relations with important countries in these strategic industries. And so we, within NATO, you need to use our very same national levers of national power to compete more effectively with Russia, both in the NATO region, but also in third countries across the world. I will leave it there and can answer any of these points in greater detail during Q&A. Thank you very much.
I'm back. Thank you, Doctor, for that great presentation. It was a very stark wake-up, I think, for many as we look to the issue of what will our response be, especially when you look to your discussion of their ballistic missile development. They've put a great deal of effort, as you just indicated, the most modern system that anyone has, and it certainly should give us some greater dedication to our own modernization. I want to apologize for losing signal. You would think in our business district on the weekend I wouldn't have much competition for bandwidth, but apparently I do. If it begins to break up again, I'll take Andrew Wallace's recommendation and I'll turn off my camera and just use the microphone. But if Cedric, if our rapporteur could come back up also, we're now going to begin our discussion. And I know we have many individuals who have questions both for Dr. Connolly and for our rapporteur. Ethan will be conducting the questioning, the identifying of people who are on the request list. Ethan, if you'll tell us who you're going to be bringing up next.
We will bring up Iraqi Berelia from the Georgian delegation.
And if you could, in your questions, identify who you're directing them to, it will be helpful for our presenters.
He's on his way up right now.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, Iraqi. Nice to see you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I would like to thank the rapporteur and the presenter. Great document, a great presentation. My question is, and actually it's a comment to Mr. Perrin, to the rapporteur. I would like to thank him, first of all, and congratulate him on producing an excellent report on Russia's military modernization, which is well structured, well presented. This is a great document that comprehensively describes the challenges emanating from Russia, as well as the scope and the size of that Russian challenge. As you all know, Georgian delegation has presented a proposal for a couple of changes, which in our judgment would make this excellent paper reflect important issues in more details. The first one concerns paragraph 4. It clearly describes that Russia started its military modernization since 2008. However, it would be more accurate and more clear to emphasize that Russia engaged in its military modernization since 2008 in the aftermath of the full-scale military aggression against Georgia, subsequent occupation of Georgia's 2 regions, and illegal declaration of their independence, which established a dangerous pattern of Russia's further aggressive actions in Ukraine and elsewhere. So it would reflect more clearly how and when everything actually started. The second proposal is about paragraph 4, which also quite clearly speaks about shift to a more aggressive foreign policy by Moscow and talks about force deployment in Syria, support to militant groups in Ukraine. And in our judgment, it should also include the occupation of 2 Georgian regions because it preceded the annexation of Crimea, as well as force deployment in Syria. And the third one is for where we also propose to include posture, where we propose to include Russian illegal deployments of its forces in Georgia, in Ukraine, in Moldova, and that Russian activities in the region pose a very significant threat, not only to the Black Sea security, but also to the wider Euro-Atlantic security. This is what our proposals were about, and it would be our humble request to the extent possible to reflect those changes in the document. Thank you very much again. It's an excellent report.
I just want to point out that obviously these reports are available for wide dissemination for a good period of time, to the extent that people can bring forward recommendations and engage with the rapporteur while we're doing the development of these to their final form. It certainly would be helpful. Perrin, would you like to respond? Rapporteur Perrin, would you like to respond?
Oui, je vous entends. Alors, j'ai entendu ce qu'a dit.
Yes, I heard what Chairman Turner said. There are some amendment, however, that was sent after the deadline. So there are rules, and after those deadlines, only the rapporteur can make amendments. So I think we can accommodate these amendments. For the Georgian delegation, the amendments that you sent are close to those that you submitted in the spring. During the session online that took place in September, rather. But I took that into account. So in page 5, you have a text that talks about the large-scale aggression against Georgia in 2008, and that it clearly demonstrates a shift in the Russian foreign policy. So I think you can look at this page 5 and probably think that your comments were taken into account with these changes.
Thank you, Ethan. And would you like to go to our next questioner?
Would, and I would also ask Richard Connolly if he can hear us to re-request the floor. We seem to have lost him temporarily. He's done so now. Okay, great. The next speaker is Nico Falcoy from Romania.
I hope you can hear me and you can see me. Okay, hello everybody. Actually, I don't have a question. I have few comments because like any other citizen from the eastern part of Europe, I'm very interested in all the issue regarding Russian Federation and his military capabilities. First of all, I would like to thank Dr. Richard Connolly for his great presentation and to our colleague Cedric Perrin for writing this comprehensive report dedicated to the Russian Federation. We all need reports such as this one dedicated to the modernization of Russian military capabilities in order to understand the direction and the future strategic profile on this major international actor. This report is very well structured and highlights all those aspects useful in assessing Moscow military potential. It is up to us to draw more conclusion from this report for how we assess the impact of Russia's strategic position on NATO's deterrent strategy on the eastern flank. I believe that the challenges raised by the modernization of Russian military capabilities should also be considered at the regional level, especially on the northern flank and in the Black Sea region. That is where, in fact, NATO must strengthen his presence and approach in a unified and balanced way the entire eastern border of the alliance. I would also like to point out the importance of another topic addressed in this report, which can provide us with support in a debate on NATO's position on the Russian Federation. The importance of military exercises as a very solid chapter in Russian military strategy is well presented in the report, and I think it can be an important topic for possible new recommendation for our alliance. For our future work, I believe that we should continue to evaluate the military strategy of the Russian Federation in the post-pandemic strategic context. And in the end, I appreciate that the report is a very good basis for a parliamentary debate and will contribute to achieve the objective we have assumed. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Ethan, we have a number of individuals who've requested to speak. Perhaps we could take at least the next two and start taking them in groups of two.
Yes, sir. The next two speakers will be both from the United Kingdom, Colonel Bob Stewart and the Right Honorable Alec Shelbrooke.
Everyone, thank you so much for your presentation, both very valuable indeed. Could I raise the topic of looking at it from the other way around? Could I ask Cedric primarily, how do the Russians view the strength of NATO? They're obviously modernizing, and they're modernizing to a strategy, but they will be modernizing against NATO. For example, how they have the big advantage of homogeneity, as it were. They can make a decision and everyone will follow it. We have the disadvantage of 30 nations, 30 states within our alliance. They actually have huge advantages of having their doctrine, again, solid all the way through. We do not. we will take a lot of time to make a decision. You know, I was once in NATO headquarters and chief of policy at SHAPE. I always considered the decision-making speed of NATO was very much akin to that of a striking slug when it came to decision-making. It's got better. But so my question really, asking you, Cedric, having also been an intelligence officer once and assessed the Russians, well, actually it was the Soviet Union then, how do the Russians look at NATO? Where do they think our weaknesses are? And obviously that then goes through to the way they're actually organizing their own forces. So in short, from your point of view, Cedric, with your expertise, what do the Russians think of NATO as an effective alliance? Thank you.
Then we have Alex Shelbrick bringing up,
Je
please.
reprends la parole. Ah, pardon.
On va faire les deux en même temps, s'il vous plaît. Merci.
We'll take two questions at a time.
Okay, can you hear me? Yep. Thanks, Ethan, and Colonel Stewart and I are doing a bit of double act because my question's to Dr. Connolly. Dr. Connolly, you said in your report, which is undoubtable, that Russia is stronger on land than at sea. And just to sort of explore that about what you mean by that, is this a relative comment in terms of looking at their land ballistic missiles, but not to underestimate their strength at sea? I note from the report the Yasin class submarines, only one was completed by 2017, but 6 in various stages. And it's commented that that's depending on the economic situation and whether you had any view as to whether Russia was capable of taking those forward. And therefore, this leads on to what is the North Atlantic naval threat? We talk about the Black Sea, which is a different thing entirely. But what is the North Atlantic naval threat from Russia? We have seen reports before that there are more modern Russian submarines in the North Atlantic than since the 1980s. And so therefore, what do you think the strategic view of Russia's naval activity is, bearing in mind the reduction in spending because of the economic consequences? Is that going to hold it back, or do they still see this as fundamental because of the high North? And with the Prime Minister's announcement last week in the review that we're massively increasing our defence spending and focusing on naval spending as well, does that nudge the Russians back into naval spending, or is the whole thing reliant on the economic situation at the time?
Thank you. So for order, if we could have our rapporteur answer first, and then Dr. Connolly. And Dr. Connolly, if you'd answer for on both those issues, I'd love to get your perspective also on Russia's view of NATO.
Absolument. Absolument.
Yes, absolutely. So first, thank you very much, Bob and Alec, for your questions. I would have preferred seeing Bob face to face, because last time we were able to discuss this over some refreshments and a very nice meal. So I wish we could do that again. So my warmest greetings. It was a very interesting and relevant question on the decision-making speed of NATO. There's a real issue there related to country which, through its unity and its stable doctrine, can act much faster. But I think that Dr. Connolly will perhaps be able to add some useful additional information on that topic, which I'm also very interested in. As for the other questions by Alec, they were probably aimed more to Dr. Connolly, so I suggest giving him the floor.
You're muted, Richard. Please unmute your microphone.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, sorry about that. I didn't turn it on to Moose. So to take the first point about Russian views of NATO, this is something which I do a lot of, is looking at strategic documents written by Russians, by Russian bureaucrats, in which their view of the world, whether it be economic, political, foreign policy, or whatever, is explained, I think, in a reasonably predictable and reasonably clear fashion. If we're thinking about their views of NATO, I mean, the first point is the one that you so clearly identified, and that is that they're well aware that as NATO membership goes up, cohesion, in their view, goes down. And so that means that if it comes ever to a point of conflict, then they have, in a sense, an advantage of not having to agree with 20-odd other members about a course of action. That was the case, I think, in the Cold War, to a lesser extent because it had more allies than in the Warsaw Pact, but certainly is the case today. So that speed of decision making is something that they see as one of their advantages, one of their very clear advantages. And that's why operating at or just below the threshold of outright conflict is seen as something that can sow discord, can cause a lack of unity in NATO countries. If we're looking at strengths in military and security terms, firstly, economic. They look at the nature of any conflict. If it's a conflict that looks as though it's going to be protracted, then Russia stands to come off worse because its economy, even measured at purchasing power parity, is still a long way off the collective strength of NATO, and is a long way off just even the size of the United States. So economic weakness is one area. If we look at military aspects, they're particularly concerned about aerial and naval threats. Russia has, going back to the Soviet period, always been very concerned about US carrier groups, for instance, and in particular about threats to Russia's naval nuclear deterrent. So that's a particular point. They're also concerned about precision missiles. They were very concerned about the idea of prompt global strike. And you'll be familiar with the fact that they're also worried about areas where NATO countries, and particularly the US, have technological advantages, hence the concern shown over things like anti-ballistic missile defense. So they generally see themselves as only having a few areas of relative strength, and those being having a smaller decision-making time and having advantages on the ground. They've got heavier artillery, they've got more tanks. So if they can bring you in and get dirty on the ground, then they see themselves as having advantages there, in particular if you're operating close to their territory. But many of the things that they focus on reflect their perception of those weaknesses. To take one example, if we look at aerospace, one of the areas where Russia does particularly well is in its construction of an integrated air defense system. It has this enormous network of radar systems, surface-to-air missile systems, guns, close range, as well as aircraft. And they're all part of the same network. They're not seen as operating independently. They're all seen as helping not just each other, but also ground forces and naval forces. But that it was built precisely because of this perception of NATO advantages in air power. So on to the second question, which was really directed towards naval points. I've written quite a lot about this, so I can go into more details offline at a later point if you wish. But to take a few points, Russia's shipbuilding program at the moment is the third largest in the world, right? Second only to China and the US. The problem is, one, they're not building those ships as quickly as they would like to. That's not because of money. They've spent plenty of money on this and they've allocated plenty of money. The problem is that those shipyards have not been able to make all of the necessary components. Some of that was because of the breakdown of relations with Ukraine, who used to build engines, gas turbines, and gear reduction units for large warships. And some of it, again, is back to the point that I made in my presentation. Serial production of certain components that you need for new systems like the Yasen, like the Bore, have proven slower to develop. And therefore, they haven't been able to push these units through as quickly. But if you look at all of the things laid down, if they were to all end up reaching the Navy in the next 5 or 6 years, that would result in a significant modernization of the Russian fleet. However, the problem is, of course, that has to be spread across 4 fleets: the Northern Fleet, the Pacific Fleet, the Baltic and the Black Sea, and a flotilla in the Caspian. And it's only really the Caspian and the Black Sea that are at a stage of high modernization. You mentioned the North Atlantic. The Northern Sea Fleet has enjoyed a slower rate of modernization. Now, it started from the best point. It had the best maintained Soviet era and early 90s equipment. But nevertheless, that is now largely dated. In terms of deliveries of new systems, the Northern Sea has taken the 2 Admiral Gorshkov frigates, but only 2. That's not as many as they would have liked. They're building lots of icebreakers, nuclear powered and conventionally powered. And so there's a great deal of political importance attached to the Northern Fleet area, as well as the Arctic, and I would include that with it. But in terms of what it is that they're rearming the Northern Sea Fleet for, and this is what I was talking about, and I said it's important to link it with strategy, it's not so much to conduct a sort of a Tom Clancy Red Storm Rising interdiction into the North Atlantic in the event of a ground war. Instead, it is to protect that area closer to Russia, in particular the Northern Sea route, which they see as being of strategic importance over the coming decades. So icebreakers, new submarines, new frigates, and new ships are supposed to be deployed in that area, as well as performing the primary function of protecting, the bastion function of protecting Russia's sea-based nuclear deterrence. Your final point you made about the economic threats to this naval rearmament, I'll make the simple point again. It's not a matter of money. They've got lots of money. If you adjust naval spending for purchasing power parity, it's a very impressive naval procurement budget. The problem is that these shipyards are not used to producing warships, modern warships on the scale that they were in the Cold War, and they're being asked to build new designs, develop new designs whilst under construction, and that has resulted in the factories, the shipyards, being much slower at producing them. So it's not finance, it's rather an industrial constraints that are preventing Russia from being from building these ships as quickly as they would like. However, they have been laying down more in the last year. You mentioned the Yasen. There were initially 7. There are now 9 at various stages of production. They believe that they've now hit the point where they can enter serial production. Whether this is true or not, or it's just positive PR, I'm not sure. But the shipyards seem to suggest that they finally worked out how to produce these at a faster rate. That remains to be seen.
Dr. Connolly, we're benefiting from your vast knowledge. I am going to have to ask for some shorter answers in the next round of questions. That's okay. No, we really appreciate all the detail you're giving us, and your knowledge and expertise is certainly wonderful. We have 4 more questioners. We're going to take those in groups of 2. And then wrap up this section. So Ethan, we could consider this closed with these current 4 that have requested to speak. We'll then hear those questioners and answers, please.
Yep, list is now closed. The first of the next 2 speakers is Utku Kakirozer from Turkey, and then he will be followed by Andrew Wallace from Australia. It's coming up right now. It's a bit of a delay. I apologize for this. Perhaps we could go to Andrew Wallace and ask Mr. Kakirozer to re-request the floor.
Good morning, gentlemen. Good morning, and thank you for your report, Mr. Perrin. My question goes to Dr. Connolly, and I saw the on the slides there the map that showed the Russian infiltration of its resources and ability to be able to extend throughout much of the world, which was quite alarming in some respects. But looking at that map, it seems that they're adopting a very similar approach to China and their ability to be able to exert soft diplomacy and soft power throughout the world. I'm wondering to what extent they're also adopting a debt diplomacy approach as China is doing. That's my first question. My second one is more of an observation, and that is that I would encourage the NATO PA to, when they're also looking at Russia's modernization of its military, that you obviously in future I would ask that you also look similarly at China's military modernization, because I don't think you should look at one without the other. Thank you.
Now we'll bring Utku Kakirozer from Turkey back up. I believe he's solved the problem. In the interest of time, it does seem there is a problem with Mr. Kakirosa's connection, so perhaps we could answer that question. And I can note briefly that there is a proposal to work on Chinese military modernization and defense posture for our next committee for next year. So I can help with that right away.
Okay, so I answer the question, Ethan, and answer it very briefly. As requested. The short answer to whether or not Russia is using debt diplomacy is yes, but to a much lesser extent than China. China has enormous financial resources that Russia quite simply doesn't have on that scale. But to give you one example of how they do it is that they will produce export nuclear power stations. Russia accounts for around about a quarter of all exports of nuclear power stations across the world. And what it does is use a state development bank, VEB, to provide the financing to countries like Bangladesh and others to build those nuclear power stations. So they act as essentially vendor financiers. They give them the money to buy the Russian products and then they pay it back over time. But that's one of only a few examples. In most instances, the Russians ask for the money to be paid by the other side without Russian loans. So yes, but to a much lesser extent.
Ethan, our last two questioners.
Yes, we have from Portugal, Lara Martinho, who's coming up right now, and then she'll be followed by Gatis Iglatis from Latvia.
Hello, good afternoon to all. I would like to thank you, Cedric, for his interesting report and also for the interesting presentation of Dr. Richard Connolly. And I had a question to Dr. Richard. I would like to ask if you already have some thoughts or some indication of how the pandemic will affect the Russian investment on defense. Thank you.
We'll bring up Sir Gratis.
Yes, hello. Hello, everyone. A question maybe to Mr. Perrin. Russia has been engaged recently in a number of costly foreign adventures, military adventures. I can mention Eastern Ukraine, Syria, Libya now, Sudan recently, and all of this in rather difficult economic conditions that were mentioned in the previous presentations. So I mean, the economy has been rather weak, also because of oil and so on. So my question is, all these costly adventures, foreign adventures, I mean, they are taking away a lot of resources, military resources. Does that maybe possibly mean that the countries closer to Russia maybe can feel a bit safer, so to say, paradoxically? Also NATO itself, because Russia at some point risks of being sort of overstretched in these foreign adventures, which are costly. I think Syria alone is taking billions every year. So the question is basically, yes, can countries being closer to Russia actually feel safer from this?
Again, gentlemen, if we can begin with our rapporteur. Cedric, if you might. Then we'll go to Dr. Connolly.
On the question that's just been asked by this, yes, we mentioned in the report the question of Russian investment in the defense realm, and I worked a lot on the way that Russia could make progress when it comes to their military arsenal, given their budget, which was similar to France or the UK when it comes to military spending. So I'm speaking under supervision of Dr. Connolly, but we estimated that 60 billion dollars that was spent by Russia, whereas the annual investment was more in the range of 200 billion. So there are resources that are taken from some budgets, some health budgets or youth budgets or other areas who are witnessing difficulties and having an impact on domestic policy. But today, Russia, as it is intervening abroad, and you've mentioned several examples abroad, and Russia can do so because it uses private militias such as the Wagner Group to carry out these expeditions. So I don't think the neighboring countries should feel more insecurity given this situation that the country is going through, but I don't have first-hand knowledge of this, but what we can say is that Russia relies a lot on these private militias and will probably do more so in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. To answer the question about the impact of the pandemic on Russian defense spending, again, I'll make just two simple points. One is in relation to the overall economic performance. According to the IMF, so this isn't official Russian sources, but according to the IMF, Russia's economy should contract by about 4 to 4.5% this year. That's compared to an average of somewhere between 8 and 10% in Europe and North America. So that should give you an idea about how in relative terms, how the Russian economy has performed during the pandemic. Despite the decline in the price of oil earlier on in the year, it's ended up performing pretty well. For details that I won't go into because I need to keep myself brief, but it's done better than many thought that it would, and it's certainly done better than most NATO members, certainly any large NATO members. What does this mean for defense spending? Well, defense spending is and has historically always been an inelastic component of Russian state expenditure. It's the last thing to be cut. So whilst lots of other parts of the Russian budget have been cut, the budget that's just being developed at the moment suggests that in 2020, Russian defense spending will, as a proportion of GDP, rise in 2020. I'll say that again, it will rise. For most countries, I suspect it will decline. For 2021 and 22, the period that they're planning at the moment, it will be higher than it was in 2019 as a percentage of GDP. That's notwithstanding some of the cuts that are mentioned in the report. They were a small number of cuts targeted at just procurement and that wasn't being spent anyway. So in real terms, I don't think that the Russians will spend a great deal less over the course of the next 2 or 3 years than they would have spent had COVID-19 not happened. So that's important for thinking about the relative Russian military capability over the course of the next 5 years. They will not be reducing down their investment in this area on a scale that I suspect a lot of other countries will.
Ethan, Udku was in the queue, and I see that he has returned. Could you bring him up and let him ask his question?
Try one more time. I believe he might have been using the wrong browser, so hopefully we fix that problem. There he is.
Seems gone again. Nope. Do you have him? Yes, great.
Mike, perfect.
Do you hear me?
Yes, we do.
Yeah, thanks for your patience. Cedric, congratulations for your report. It's really an eye-opening report for all of us. And Dr. Connolly, thank you for your presentation. I would like to, especially after the when I see in Cedric's report that Syria and Ukraine has been sort of testing lab for Russian military capacity, I would like to draw your attention to Nagorno-Karabakh, actually. Following Armenia's aggression on Azerbaijan in July, and then in October, the apathetic approach taken by the Minsk Group co-chairs has proven to be a grave mistake. Unfortunately, NATO, although not a direct stakeholder or a primary responder in the region, also followed a similar path. Both Armenia and Azerbaijan are NATO's partners. The alliance should have been able to call a spade a spade. On the contrary, our alliance, NATO, refrained even from referring to UN Security Council resolutions. So, we have taken a more active approach during the following the illegal annexation of Crimea by the Russian Federation. The alliance should have reacted against the aggression by Armenia, a CSTO ally of Russia, on Azerbaijan. So my question, or to both of the speakers, is that do you think that NATO's anodyne stance vis-a-vis the recent conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh was a mistake? And do you think that NATO has thus left an unrented space to Russia, which now deployed peacekeepers in the region? And what might be its outcome? I mean, the Russia's military presence in Nagorno-Karabakh at the moment for our military planning in NATO. Thank you.
Beginning again with our rapporteur, Perrin, and then Dr. Connolly.
I'd rather not answer this question. Thank you.
If you like, I'll just simply provide a very short answer based not so much on my own point of view, but on that I read in Russian sources. And if you read some of the more preeminent thinkers on Russian foreign policy over the course of the last week or so, I would suggest that their conclusions in some way match the point that was just made, insofar as they see this as the agreement, the settlement in Nagorno-Karabakh as something that is broadly in line with Russian interests. The fact that Russian peacekeepers are there, the fact that there aren't many other countries involved, certainly not the US and other larger European powers, is something that from the Russian side they see as being a good thing. So that's a short answer, and I'm merely relaying the view from Moscow.
Well, I'll just add my own editorializing. I never ever think of Russian troops as peacekeeping. Gentlemen, appreciate your comments. Dr. Connolly, you are an incredible expert and a great communicator. Thank you for the additional information that you provided us today and for your participation. This has been a great session, and we appreciate our rapporteur's work that has allowed us to have this discussion today. Dr. Connolly, thank you for being with us. Cedric, you get to stay with us because you got a lot more work to do left. We first now turn to your report and the adoption of the report. Ethan will conduct the tallying of the votes and can describe this to our membership. And then after that, Cedric will take up the resolution.
Could the NATO PA staff please launch the poll for the adoption of the report? You'll have 1 minute to vote, please. Thank you very much. Okay, could the NATO PA staff please close the poll and publish the results for us? Excellent. Mr. Turner, we have results. It's 29 votes in favor, 0 no votes, and 0 abstentions.
To our rapporteur, if we were not meeting virtually, you'd be met with rounds of applause of the acceptance of your report. Thank you for your great work. We're now going to turn to the consideration of amendments in the vote on the draft resolution on maintaining Allied defense investment momentum after COVID-19. Cedric, would you like to make some comments concerning the draft resolution before we entertain amendments?
Oui, merci, merci Mike.
Thank you very much, Mike. Thank you for your confidence, dear colleagues. So thanks for the opportunity to present this resolution of our committee. I'm sure that you weren't surprised by the theme of this resolution because, as you are all fully aware, this pandemic has had a huge impact on all our societies and questioning all the norms and habits of our daily lives. And we have proof today by the fact that we are now communicating virtually. The tragic loss of human lives due to this pandemic has been unprecedented over the past century, and more people will die, unfortunately, in the future, and many more will be very ill because of this virus, and we'll probably need many years to climb out of the hole in which our economies have been plunged. The Alliance has played a major role during this crisis. The solidarity that is shown by allies have been able to buffer some of these consequences, and this resolution wishes to pay tribute to the allies' response and the cooperation amongst allies, which help us to cope with the most urgent needs via deliveries of medical supplies, logistical transport, repatriation. So several hundred missions have been, critical missions have been carried out and benefited thousands of members of our armed forces. And the armed forces have also demonstrated during this pandemic of determination to carry out all the operations and missions and to deliver the defense and deterrence posture. If we add this up to all the other measures taken since 2014 to enhance our collective defense, NATO today is even more ready to face up to threats and challenges it has to confronted with than it was 5 years ago. However, the impact of the pandemic will have a major impact on the Allies' budget defense and highlights the need of the Allies to carry out, to pursue the progress that has been achieved so far to maintain a fair burden sharing. And the European allies and Canada have increased their budgets for the past 6 years by investing in capability projects that the alliance greatly needs. And this momentum must not be lost and is essential for the future of the alliance. And the continuation of these investments nationally will be important, not only to increase the resilience of each ally, but also our common posture, collective posture. And so the resolution recalls the essential role played by all the armed forces during the pandemic and calls upon to protect them against a greater risk and to reduce costs wherever possible. And the investments in defense cannot be postponed as they are essential. This resolution calls upon all the allies to recommit themselves and to respect the pledges taken during the Wales summit. The members of the alliance must recognize that these investments allow us not only to protect ourselves against all the complex threats that we are all facing in the 21st century, but they contribute also to fight against the pandemic. The resolution also stipulates that we should increase Euro-Atlantic industrial cooperation and calls on all the allies to protect their essential infrastructure against foreign predators, especially if these actors are peer competitors. Dear colleagues, I'm sure that you will all agree to this crucial message that is carried by this resolution. I hope that you will support it and contribute collectively to create a bulwark against those who are calling on us to reduce our defense spending, but we vitally need to carry on these vital efforts that we have already undertaken. Thank you very much.
Cedric, thank you. We'll now take up the issue of amendments. If we could have our committee secretary join us. Mel will be helping us through the voting process on this platform with respect to amendments. It's our intention to go through the amendments and have a resolution of each of the amendment and then vote on the resolution in its entirety rather than by block or by paragraph, since the platform that we're currently under. Mel, welcome to joining us. We will begin with amendment number 1, which comes from the Ukrainian delegation. What we're going to do is have each of the amendment sponsors speak, and then if we could have our rapporteur respond, then we can determine whether or not others need to speak or whether or not the resolution might be resolved with the discussion between Cedric and the amendment offerer. So Ethan, if you could please bring up the author of amendment number 1 with the Ukraine delegation.
I have received a message, sir, from the Ukrainians that they would like to withdraw this amendment.
Excellent. We will proceed. We appreciate the amendment was offered so that we at least have the review of the material by the delegation.
If I may, sir, I do know that the rapporteur would still like to make a comment about that paragraph and I will leave him to explain.
Cedric, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dear colleagues, we noted with the Secretariat of the committee that bullet 7 is not satisfactory in the French version. The idea is the same. We talk about provocation by Russia, and we talk about it in the general report that we adopted yesterday on the preparedness of NATO forces. I think Ethan had a PowerPoint. Yes, I was supposed to show a slide, but I can't do that right now. Oh, I have it. I have it. So the changes can be seen in French and in English. So I just mentioned them. I shall not repeat. Can everybody see the? Ethan is going to read. Donc, dénonçant les provocations à cession de la Russie par lesquelles elle fait non seulement état de ses nouvelles capacités militaires, mais cherche aussi à sonder l'état de préparation des forces de l'OTAN sur terre, dans les airs, en mer et dans l'espace. Alors, c'est plus en phase avec les intentions initiales de notre rapporteur. Merci. Thank you, Ethan.
Concluding your presentation then with respect to Amendment 1? Yes. We will turn next to Amendment number 2, which is from the Belgian delegation. Ethan, will you bring up the author?
The Belgian delegation, please request the floor. Monsieur Daniel Bakelen va présenter.
Voilà, oui, je viens de demander la parole.
In fact, the Belgian delegation submitted 3 amendments. The first on B, bullet B, and we suggest to go back to the Wales wording. We must increase defense expenditures to tend to devote 2% of the GDP, because only 10 countries go beyond that limit. So we want to urge and encourage the nations to do so that they spend 2% of their GDP for defense expenditures. I am fine with this amendment, but we should delete de before consacré. We should say at least. I shall read it in French. So we would like to add at least. because the pandemic, as I recalled, had a negative impact on the increase of our GDP. So this will reduce the absolute value of the 2% of GDP. So we must contribute in our national parliaments to maintain a substantial investment level beyond 2% of the GDP when, of course, that is possible. Is that okay for the Belgian delegation? Yes, that's fine. I can move to the two next amendments.
Mel, if you would, Daniel, if you'd pause, Mel, if you would conduct the vote on amendment number 2 as just edited by Cedric and offered by the Belgian delegation.
Yes, we will proceed to vote on this amendment number 2 now. Please click on polls on the right side of your screen. Please choose whether you wish to adopt, reject, or abstain. You have 1 minute to do so. I start the timer now.
Mel, your microphone's not open. I believe you were.
Thank you. NATO PA staff, could you please close the poll so we can see the results? Let me, here we go. We have 23 votes in favor, 2 against, and 4 abstain. That means the amendment is adopted.
The amendment's adopted. Daniel, if you would present your amendment number 3.
Oui. Alors, l'amendement numéro 3, donc je le présente en lieu et place de de mon collègue, de notre collègue Hugues Bayet, qui est le membre effectif de la commission.
Hugues Bayet should have introduced this amendment. I am the alternate member. He has he's lost a member of his family, so he cannot attend. So he would like to add an additional point between B and C to devote a significant part, etc., in order to you must have that in the table of resolutions, and to pay tribute to the courage and the devotion of military staff. So we want to, through this amendment, insist on the added value of the military contribution for this first and second wave. I am against this amendment. I'm not in favor of it. Our soldiers deserve our respect and for the sacrifices that they have made. I did, as a French national, had to pay tribute to the soldiers. So 13 soldiers died in Mali a year ago, and Jean-Marie Bockel's son died and was part of these 13 soldiers. so I think that we must have the proper equipment for our soldiers. You know how our budgetary procedures work. So if you want these personnel expenditures to be part of the 2% of the GDP that we agreed to devote to military expenditures, it goes against the aim of the resolution. Of course, we can advocate for strong measures in favor of our military, but we must also make sure that the proper budgets are there to help them with proper equipment. So we do understand the significance of paying tribute and guaranteeing the best circumstances and for our soldiers. I share your point of view, but as I explained, as an alternate member, I submitted Mr. Dailly's amendment. He wished for the Assembly to vote on this amendment. So
opposition to this amendment. If you would like to proceed with it, then we must first ask whether or not anyone has requested to speak on it prior to just going to a vote. I do think there's going to be significant opposition. We have one individual who's requested to speak. Can we ascertain, Ethan, if that is on this amendment?
I've been trying to do so, sir. I was unable, so perhaps we could bring up Mr. Devakis to see if this is in fact the case.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Greece is one of the few countries in the alliance, if not the only country, I suppose, to have increased its annual defense spending for military equipment during the pandemic from 530 million in 2020 to a projected 2.3 billion in 2021. This dramatic increase in capital investment for the armed forces is a direct response to the expanding security challenges that Greece and several of its partner nations face in the Eastern Mediterranean region. In particular, one of the main challenges is the need to secure and defend the newly discovered gas reserves, which are critical to the energy security of Europe from threats such as the illegal interference of regional state actors and the operation of terrorist networks and organizations. It is also a response to the inexplicable delay in the mobilization of the immense leverage of European institutions towards an effort to secure Europe's borders and defend international law and order in the Eastern Mediterranean. In this context, and as far as the Greek delegation is concerned, the resolution we are debating today is preaching to the convert. In other words, I fully agree that international security challenges are on the rise, and I believe that they will keep being on the rise as long as regional leaders continue to see threats, violence, and illegal interference as legitimate tools of international affairs. Hence, I fully support the resolution and its conclusions. Thank you for listening.
Thank you for your comments. I see no one else who has requested to speak. At this point, we will take a vote. Mel, and as everyone who's in attendance has noted, both myself and Cedric have indicated our opposition to this amendment. And if people would begin voting now under Mel's direction.
Members, please proceed to vote. Please click on polls. You will then find the poll on amendment number 3.
C'est pas 3, oui.
Thank you. NATO PA staff, please close the poll.
Mel, would you please
Okay, yes.
report the result?
Yes, the result is in. We have 5 votes in favor, 23 against, and 1 abstain. So the resolution is the amendment is rejected.
The amendment fails. We'll turn to amendment number 4. Daniel, if you could present this amendment for us.
Oui, alors l'amendement numéro 4, de nouveau proposé par...
Once again, it's an amendment submitted by Hugues Daillet. So it's adding an item between F and G to increase investments in the medical components of the armed forces to increase the expertise in allied armed forces, etc. I don't have any particular comment, but thank you, Daniel. I am in favor of it if we delete the end of the sentence to protect it against so the use of outsourcing. So the idea is to develop the medical component, but I'm not against outsourcing. It's up to any nation to decide. So if outsourcing is good and allows for better results and better productivity, so I'm in favor of the amendment if we delete the end of the sentence. Mr. Bakelen is in agreement with the rapporteur. So, Mr. Chairman, I'm done on this amendment number 4.
On amendment
Mel,
number 4.
If we could take a vote with the amendment as edited by Cedric.
Okay, then please turn on the polls. On amendment number 4, we start now. So NATO PA staff, please close the polls. We should have the results in any minute. So the results on amendment number 4, 25 in favor, 3 against, and 2 abstain. That means amendment number 4 is adopted.
Deux abstentions.
Merci.
Danielle, I want to thank you for your assistance. Amendment number 4 has passed. Mel, thank you for your assistance also in this. And to Cedric, thank you for your work in getting us through the amendments and the discussion with our members. We're now, unless Cedric, unless you have additional comments, we'll proceed to adopt the resolution.
As amended.
Seeing none, Ethan?
Yeah.
Ethan, if you could begin, we will now work to adopt the resolution as amended.
Thank you, sir. Would the NATO PA staff please now launch the poll to adopt the resolution as amended? poll is now closed, and could the staff please publish the results? We have, where's 2, 3, sorry. 29 votes in favor, 1 abstention.
The resolution is adopted. Cedric, thank you for your great work on both the resolution and all the amendments and working with all the delegations on their concerns and issues with respect to the resolution and for the report and for your great discussion today.
Mr. Turner, if I may, we would also perhaps like to say welcome back to Daniel Beckelin, who was a former vice president of the NATO Parliamentary Assembly, who has just been rejoined the Belgian delegation. Thank him for his contribution.
Excellent. Wonderful. Turning to the next item on our agenda, right, Ethan? We're going to move now to elections. Excellent. We have 2 vacancies on vice chairpersons of the main committee, 2 vacancies of vice chairpersons of subcommittees, 1 vacancy of a vice chairperson, and re-election of all eligible officers. Unless someone requests to speak, I'm going to read these, and because we have no one in opposition to those who are standing for the positions, we will adopt them by silent acclamation. Ethan, may I proceed with that?
Yes, sir.
Okay, we have 2 vacancies for vice chairperson of the DSC. Nico of Romania and Utku of Turkey are interested in standing for this position. We have received no other names. As we've said before, we usually accept them by acclamation if they are open. So seeing that no one has requested to speak, we will accept Nico of Romania and Utku as vice chairpersons of the main committee. Congratulations to both of you. Turning on to the 2 vacancies for vice chairpersons. For the Subcommittee on Future Security and Defense Capabilities, there are 2 vacancies for vice chairperson. Pierre Hughes from Canada has submitted his candidacy, and Andreas of Greece has expressed his interest in the vice chair position that has now been vacated by Utku. Unless, seeing that they have no opposition, we will accept them again by silent acclamation. In the Subcommittee on Transatlantic Defense and Security Cooperation, John Charles, who has held the position of ad interim rapporteur throughout the year, has expressed his interest in standing for this position today. We have not received any other candidacies. Therefore, by acclamation, we will accept Jean Claus in this position. Congratulations. We greatly appreciate your past excellent work. As Nico has moved to become a vice chairperson of the committee, there is now a vacancy in the position of vice chairperson. Therefore, we have 1 candidate, Fernando of Spain. We will consider Fernando elected by silent acclamation. Congratulations to him also. We have 2 alternate vacancies for the Ukraine-NATO Interparliamentary Council. Mr. Friki from Turkey has presented his interest in taking up one of these positions. Unless we have someone else, we will accept his position, Mr. Isaac, by silent acclamation. Congratulations. I would now like to suggest that we re-elect all other committee and subcommittee officers who are seeking recognition. Having no one else who sits in opposition to any of those positions, we will acknowledge them as all being re-elected by silent acclamation. Therefore, all our eligible officers are now re-elected for a 1-year term. I believe, Ethan, that takes care of all of the elections that we had for today.
Yes, it does. Congratulations.
Turning next to item 13, which is our future activities of the Subcommittee on Transatlantic Defense and Security Cooperation and Subcommittee on Future Security and Defense Capabilities. I will now give the floor to the 2 subcommittee chairpersons to provide an update on subcommittee activities. If we could bring up Alec from the UK, who will give us the presentation on his subcommittee.
Alec, could you please request the floor?
Then are you able to?
He has requested the floor. We'll bring him up right now.
Hi there. Thank you for the floor, Mike. I appreciate the opportunity to announce the planned programme for the DSCFC in 2021. Our Subcommittee on Future Security and Defence Capabilities plans to report on China's defence posture and its implications for NATO. This subject is important due to China's increased impact on Euro-Atlantic security questions. To study the issue, the DSCFC is proposing a visit to South Korea, as this country is among the NATO partners most directly impacted by China's rise, and their perspective on China will offer valuable insights. The subcommittee is also proposing a visit to Georgia, which had been on the 2020 agenda. Georgia remains a key strategic partner to NATO in the Caucasus. Our proposed visit would be a strong signal of our continued support for Georgia. Of course, this proposal is offered to you all with the understanding that its rollout will depend on the evolution of the pandemic, but thank you for your attention.
Excellent. Then turning to Attila, who has the DSCTC.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mike. I would like to be very brief also.
Mr. President, thank you again.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I will be brief. Of course, we also keep in mind that the pandemic situation could cause a problem with these programs, planned programs. But anyhow, we are very much interested in as a subcommittee on transatlantic defense and security cooperation on security challenges in the high north. So the region is changing quickly, and these changes impact allied security directly. So that's why we would like to visit Norway and Canada, because these are two allies with clear interest in the stability of the high north. So what we plan is to visit to Norway and to Canada, and of course the program is depending on the COVID pandemic. Thank you very much, Mike.
Thank you, Mr. President. Do we have? We now turn to the issue of any other business. Is there anyone seeking the floor for other business? I do not see any currently. I know everyone has the agenda and knows that this item is next. Seeing that no one has, we'll continue to proceed to conclude the meeting. Our next meeting is scheduled for February 22nd through 24th. I would like to thank all of you for your participation and your patience as we've done this in a virtual environment. I want to thank our staff who have adapted so well to being able to do this and allowed us to conduct these subcommittees and committees. And tomorrow for our plenary session, I want to thank Ethan Corp and of course Jay Lee, Valerie, James, our interpreters, all of the group, Mel, and certainly Dr. Connolly who participated. I think this has been very worthwhile. We've all gotten the benefit of the discussion and of the ability to deliberate and to actually produce work product. I look forward to participating with you tomorrow in the plenary session. Ethan, are there any other items that we need to bring before the committee?
There are none other than to thank you for your leadership, sir. Thank you very much.
With that, everyone, we thank you and we will be adjourned. See you tomorrow.